So when we talk about the lymphatic system, we are talking about the system that takes leftover interstitial fluid around tissue cells, returns it to a system of vessels, and goes back to the cardiovascular system. In addition to that, it also helps absorb fats from the intestines to get them back into your cardiovascular system where they're supposed to go from there. And it also is a highway for an area for immune system cells to stay in. So it also sometimes is known as the immune system. So it consists of vessels, also organs with lymphatic tissue, the bone marrow is in it, and the fluid that flows through this network of lymphatic vessels is known as lymph. So we can see in green, many times lymphatic system is denoted in green on figures where these lymphatic vessels are. And they're very similar to veins. You have lymphatic capillaries, which are open-ended that can absorb fluid. You have lymphatic vessels that follow the pathway of veins. They're actually a little bit thinner and walled with more valves, but they're very similar in structure to veins. You've got lymphatic trunks, which are where multiple lymphatic vessels come together at junctional regions of the body. For instance, at the groin, at the armpit, at the neck. And you also have in those areas lymph nodes, which lymph nodes are just clusters of encapsulated lymphatic tissue that houses lots of immune system type cells. And of course, you also have lymphatic organs sitting around. So as we said before, their main function of the lymphatic system is to drain interstitial fluid, transport dietary fats, and carry out immune responses. So the capillaries are located between cells, and they form into those larger vessels that are very thin with many valves. And we can see here that lymphatic vessel on the figure in the left sitting amongst the interstitial fluid, the tissue cells, so that that fluid that is not reabsorbed at the venial end of the capillary, that's about 3 liters roughly each day, is reabsorbed as lymph. And lymph is very, very slow moving. Actually, you can have lymphatic massages that help to promote the flow of this. Now, lymphatic capillaries, as you see on the upper right-hand side of the screen, have these open areas that are large that can allow things like bacteria and viruses to go into them. And this is one way that they differ in blood capillaries, but it's very important in the lymphatic system in that it's made to activate the immune system. So you want things like that to be activated. You want them to enter the lymphatic system so they encounter those immune system cells and start an immune response. So we go into lymph nodes and trunks, so we're talking about the direction. So lymph enters, it was interstitial fluid, so interstitial fluid and lymph are identical in composition, different in location. We call it interstitial fluid when it's around tissue cells. We call it lymph when it enters the lymphatic capillary. But those lymphatic capillaries merge into lymphatic vessels. We have lymphatic nodes that are usually in junctional regions. All those vessels merge into lymphatic trunks. So again, I said there many times in junctional regions of the body. You can see those in some of the figures in this presentation, but for example, you'll have a lumbar trunk, intestinal trunk, bronchomediastinal trunk, subclavian trunk, and jugular trunk. And they form one of two what we call ducts. Now, the most important part of this figure is actually the small figure on the left-hand side of the screen. The green covers the entire area below the diaphragm and the entire left side of the body. And that is the area of the body drained by what we call the thoracic duct. So all of the lymphatic trunks drain into one of two ducts. The thoracic duct, also known as the left lymphatic duct, and the area there in flesh color, which is the upper right-hand side of the body above the diaphragm, head, neck, arm, torso, is the right lymphatic duct. So the area in the flesh color is the area where lymph is drained by the right lymphatic duct, and the green area is the area drained by the thoracic duct. So notice the thoracic duct drains far more lymph than the right lymphatic duct. Now, if we go over to the right side of the screen, notice that both the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct drain into the junctional regions between the jugular trunk and subclavian trunk, or the jugular vein and subclavian vein. And of course, both the jugular and subclavian veins that are either on the right or left side go into the brachiocephalic vein, which then enters the superior vena cava and goes back to the heart. So this is how lymph is returned to the cardiovascular system. So there in the right, very important. You notice how all the lymph eventually gets back to the cardiovascular system. So this is many times why lymphatic massages help to drain fluids as it's pushed upward. And we can see that a little more closely here where that thoracic duct and right lymphatic duct drain between the jugular and the subclavian vein. So for tracing the flow of lymph, interstitial fluid enters lymphatic capillaries, enters lymphatic vessels, lymphatic trunks, and of course there are nodes along the way, enters the thoracic duct or the right lymphatic duct, and then goes into, I have subclavian vein here, but really, as we saw in the previous figure, it's the junction between the jugular and the subclavian vein. And you could start with, let's say, a right arm lymphatic capillary. You could be able to trace it up through the arm, through vessels, trunks, and the in that case, the right lymphatic duct into the junction between the right jugular and right subclavian veins. You could go through the vessels of the heart, back out the left side of the heart through the aorta. You could trace through the cardiovascular system, and you could end up, let's say, somewhere like the left femoral artery. So you should be able to trace lymph through the cardiovascular system and have a good, clear understanding of how that works. So looking at a couple of the tissues, there are primary lymphatic organs and there are secondary lymphatic organs. Primary lymphatic organs are where you create some specific immune cells called B and T cells. B and T cells, as we will see, are involved in specific immunity where they have specific threats against specific things they have been exposed to before it is acquired. And they are types of lymphocytes. But for those types of lymphocytes to acquire those specific threats against specific types of things, or specific arsenals against specific threats, we'll say more accurately, they have to become what is known as immunocompetent. And immunocompetent basically means they know how to do their job against that particular pathogen. And the two primary lymphatic organs are the red bone marrow and the thymus. So the red bone marrow is where we create both B and T lymphocytes. B lymphocytes become immunocompetent or learn how to do their job in red bone marrow. T lymphocytes are born, we'll say, are made in the red bone marrow, just like all other blood cells, including lymphocytes, but they travel to the thymus, which you see in this area between the lungs, to learn immunocompetence or to learn how to do their job. So primary lymphatic organs, you only have two of them. They are for training specific lymphocytes, B and T cells, which we'll talk about later on in this module on what those do specifically. But the bone marrow and the thymus are the two primary lymphatic organs that teach immunocompetence. All other lymphatic organs and tissues are considered secondary. That means they do not train those cells how to do their job. They are not locations for learning or producing lymphatic cells, but they are areas for immune system cells to, we'll say, hang out, and they can mount immune responses from there. So there are many of those, but some examples: lymph nodes, which you see on the figure. Lymph nodes have different layers. They have a cortex and a medulla, and as lymph encounters those layers, they can go across many different types of immune cells and mount immune responses. The spleen, also things called lymphatic nodules, similar to tonsils, mucosal associated lymphatic tissue along your respiratory and digestive tracts, gut associated lymphatic tissue along the intestines. So you've got many different types of that lymphatic tissue along the body, but all of those are secondary, which means their job is to house immune system cells and mount immune responses. As you know, in the bloodstream, there are far more red blood cells per drop of blood than white blood cells. This doesn't mean that your body just doesn't make a lot of them, but at any given time, they tend to not be circulating around in the bloodstream as much, but a lot of them hang out in these secondary lymphatic organs.